It was a rather normal Wednesday morning in October. That means it was cold and damp. In a house in a London borough, an alarm buzzed with its usual annoying persistence, pulling our man, David, from the edge of a rather nice dream. He groaned and fumbled for his phone to silence the noise, and rubbed the sleep from his eyes when he had completed that mission. It was barely 6:30 in the morning, and the sun hadn't even fully risen over the London skyline. He sighed, swinging his legs over the side of the bed, feeling the cold of the dark wooden floor beneath his feet. Our man had recently been on a much-needed holiday. He went for the whole past week, just him and a few mates. It had been the break he needed, far away from the madness of the city. But now it was back to the familiar routines. He pulled on a pair of work pants and headed into the kitchen. Breakfast was the usual: egg and toast, half-heartedly scrambled. It was washed down by a strong cup of coffee. He stood by the counter, staring out of the window to the street below, as the city was beginning to wake up. Nothing was amiss. To him, it was just another ordinary day. Of course, he was completely oblivious to the horrors yet to unfold. He went into the bathroom and brushed his teeth, splashing some water on his face, and glanced up into the mirror. His reflection stared back. His eyes looked more tired than he felt. There were faint lines of age creeping in around the edges of his eyes. 35 and still on the front lines, he sighed. He ran his right hand through his hair and turned away. Just before leaving the house, he grabbed his keys and headed towards the door, and made the short walk down the road to his parked car. A reliable but very old Vauxhall that had seen better days. He slid into the driver's seat, turned the keys, and the engine rumbled to life. The radio came on automatically, blasting some kind of pop music that he quickly switched off and flipped through the stations, landing on the news. The broadcaster's voice was calm but tinged with urgency. He was talking about the pandemic that was gripping the nation. He sighed, turning it off. This was all anyone was talking about lately. People falling ill, some getting better, some getting worse. The stories were getting stranger. He thought to himself, a part of our man wanted to write it off as just media hype. But after what he had seen on the news, people getting dragged out of their homes by medical units and riots, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to get worse, that it was going to spiral into chaos. His phone buzzed on the passenger's seat and David picked it up. It was Mark, his partner on the force. "Oi oi Davy boy, finally back from your little holiday?" Mark's voice cracked through the speaker, full of its usual cocky charm. "Yeah mate," David replied, smirking. "Was nice to get away from this shithole for a bit. The Lake District was nice and peaceful, none of the madness going on here." "Aye, so you've seen it then? It's a shame you missed all the fun. Riots every night, people going mental. I swear, it's like the city has lost its mind." "Yeah, that sounds about right. I saw a bit of it on the news. Are you alright though?" "Oh, you know me, mate. Fit as a fiddle. Top brass is on our ass though. Better get ready though, mate. It sounds like it's going to be another night of riots," Mark said as he chuckled. "Oh well, can't wait. I'll see you at the station, bud," David replied. Mark hung up, and our man tossed his phone back onto the seat. As he drove through the streets, the city seemed a little more quieter than usual. Not the good kind of quiet either. At a red light, he noticed a strange man holding an umbrella, swinging back and forth like he was drunk. His clothes were torn, and his beard hung low, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. Something's a little off with that fella, he thought to himself, as he squinted watching him. The man lifted his head slowly, eyes glazed and distant, staring off like he was seeing something that wasn't there. Then, without warning, he stumbled forward, tripping over his own feet and crashing into a parked car. David thought about getting out, seeing if he needed help, but before he could, a car horn blared from behind him, immediately urging him on. Our man shook his head, put his car in gear, and moved on. Whatever was going on was not his problem. Not yet, anyway. About 10 minutes later, he pulled into the station's parking lot just before 9, greeted by the police station's logo on the front of the building. He took a moment before heading inside. The buzz of the station immediately hit him as he walked through the doors. It was good to be back, he thought to himself. Colleagues greeted him as he walked in, a few with shouts of "Welcome back, Peterson," and "It's about time you showed up, man." Our man gave them a smile and a nod, and made his way to his desk. Sergeant Mitchell was already barking orders from across the room. A hearty man, a former Royal Marine with a thick London accent that I'm not even going to try to mimic. He had a no-nonsense attitude. He demanded respect with just his presence alone. "Peterson, good to have you back," Mitchell called out, while walking over, extending his hand and giving David a firm handshake. "We've got a meeting in about 5 minutes, so go ahead and get yourself settled," he said. David dropped his things off at his desk, exchanged a quick fist bump with Mark, and followed the rest of his team into the briefing room. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone was buzzing with anticipation for the night ahead. Mitchell stood at the front, his hands clasped behind his back, and a stern look on his face. "Right, listen up," he began, his voice cutting through the chatter. "As you are all well aware, we've been dealing with escalating riots for the past week. People are angry at the government, angry at the current situation, and it is our job to maintain the peace. But it is getting harder and harder." He paused, looking at each officer in the eyes, one by one. "Tonight, we are expecting more of the same, maybe even worse. There is talk of organised groups planning to hit multiple locations across the city. The government's response to the pandemic has been less than ideal, and the public are right to be angry. However, violent civil disorder will not be tolerated." Mitchell nodded towards a table at the far end of the room, with several firearms laid out upon it. He pointed with his hands and said, "Officers who've had firearms training will be authorized to carry tonight. Live ammunition is a last resort, but this situation is deteriorating fast, and we cannot lose control." David glanced over at Mark with a puzzled look on his face. They had both had firearms training, but it was rather rare for them to be called up to use it. Mitchell continued, "And before we wrap up, I'd like to welcome back Officer Peterson from his well-deserved holiday." The room erupted with applause and light-hearted jeers. David mocked a salute. He was trying to hide the nerves creeping up his spine. "Good to have you back, David. You've missed one hell of a week," Officer Lee said. The rest of the day passed by uneventfully, and as night approached, the officers began to gear up, checking equipment and running drills. But David's mind kept drifting back to the man he had seen earlier on the streets. The way he moved, the emptiness in his eyes, it was so unnerving. Just before heading out, officers were checking their gear one last time. Helmets, shields, batons, all standard issue for such a night. Mark and David stood in the locker room getting ready. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Mark asked, sliding on his gloves. "As ready as I'll ever be," David replied, tightening the straps on his vest. "I have a feeling it's going to be a very bad night." Mark gave him a grim smile, patting him on the shoulder. "Welcome back to London, mate. Just another day in paradise." The station was buzzed with nervous energy. Metal lockers clanged open and shut, the sound of boots scraping against the tiled floor filling the air. David stood in front of his locker, pulling on the straps of his body armor, utility belt and helmet. Mark was next to him, tightening the straps on his vest, whistling an old tune like it was any other day. Officer Lee was close by, putting on his gear as well. "Been a while since you suited up, eh, Davey?" Lee said, nudging him with his elbow. "Oh, come on, it's only been a few weeks," he chuckled, slipping on his gloves. "Though I have put on a few pounds. This damn thing is too tight," he said. Mark grinned and adjusted his helmet. David smiled, but the tension in his gut was hard to ignore. The room was filled with chatter and half-hearted jokes, but unease was palpable. Every officer in that locker room knew that tonight was going to be one of the worst nights so far. As they finished gearing up, a call came over the intercom, the voice of Sergeant Mitchell echoing through the room. "Attention all units. Unrest has broken out on the Lockwood estate. All available officers to deploy immediately. Repeat, all available officers to deploy immediately to the Lockwood estate." All the officers exchanged glances, their smiles now fading. The Lockwood estate was notorious, a sprawling complex of high-rises and run-down flats, a breeding ground for trouble, even on a good day. So tonight would be a war zone. "Well, I guess it's time to earn our paychecks," Mark uttered, picking up his shield and his riot baton. They loaded up, securing their firearms and batons, and rushed out of the station and into the police van, the familiar cramped space buzzing with the low hum of anxious chatter. Mark sat across from David, checking his firearm. The engine roared to life, and the van poured out of the station's garage, joining the convoy of police vehicles heading towards the estate. "Think it's going to be as bad as they say?" one of the lads, Carter, asked, his voice tense. Mark shrugged his shoulders. "If it's anything like the last few nights, it's going to be a right mess, but we'll manage. We always do, don't we?" "Yeah, I guess, but I can't shake this feeling," Carter said. "I know what you mean. I've been feeling off too, and it's not just the nerves. I don't know what it is, but it's persistent," David added. For the rest of the drive after that little conversation, the van was in silence. As they neared the estate, the first signs of unrest were impossible to miss. Smoke rose in thick, dark plumes, and the distant sound of shouting and glass breaking carried through the night. The Lockwood estate loomed ahead, a hulking mass of concrete and chaos. People were already pouring into the streets, waving signs and throwing rocks, screaming at the police. The boys jumped out of the van, shields up. Sergeant Mitchell took the lead and led his men in formation to the front. The crowd was angry. It didn't take long for the first bottle to fly, shattering against a police shield with a deafening crash. Then came the bricks, then the shouting. "Hold the line," Mitchell barked, his voice straining to raise above the noise. "Push them back," he said. The police advanced, shields up, batons ready. Flashbangs were sent firing into the crowd, and they began to beat them back. It worked for a moment, but the crowd regrouped and swarmed like ants, pressing against the police shields. It was wild. People even began to fight each other. David swung his baton, shoving a man who tried to claw at his helmet. The strangest part about it was the man snarled at him. He had wide, bloodshot eyes, and he was baring his teeth like an animal. It wasn't like any other riot he had ever seen before. It was chaos. "David," Mark shouted, catching his attention. He turned just in time to see a group of people turning on each other. It was like they had lost all sense of who they were. David's eyes went wide. "What the hell is happening?" "We're losing control," Mark yelled over the din. "We're going to have to pull back." Mitchell's voice came over the radio, confirming what they already knew. "All units fall back. Retreat to your vehicles now." The police fought their way back to their vehicle. David's squad piled back into the back of their van, shields raised against the barrage of rocks and debris. Carter was holding his arm, wincing in pain, as he climbed inside. "You right there, Carter?" one of the lads, Mason, asked, noticing his pained expressions. Yeah, Carter said, his voice strained. "One of those crackheads bit me though, right on the bloody arm." They all looked at him and laughed. Mason snorted, a nervous laugh escaping him. "Watch it, mate. You're probably infected. You're going to turn into a bloody crackhead zombie jonesing for your next high any minute now." Carter rolled his eyes, forcing a grin despite the pain. Yeah, real funny. Pass me over a bandage, you muppet." Officer Lee slammed the door shut and the van sped away, retreating from the chaos. The streets were full of the sounds of chaos and police sirens. They headed for the field HQ, the air thick with tension and confusion. No one said much on the ride back. What was there to say? They had lost control. Back at HQ, Carter was taken straight to the medical room. The rest of the team piled out of the van, battered and exhausted. David and Mark spotted Mitchell near the command tent, outside the temporary HQ building. He was talking to another officer who looked just as shell-shocked as the rest of them. David walked over, Mark trailing behind. "Sergeant, what the hell is going on out there?" David asked, pulling off his helmet. It's like everyone's losing their bloody minds." "Sir, we saw people attacking one another with their teeth." Mitchell's face was pale, his usual stern demeanour cracked by the night's events. He rubbed his temples, clearly struggling to make sense of it all. "To be quite honest, David, I have no bloody idea, mate. We've got reports coming in from all over, riots breaking out everywhere, just like this, up and down the country. We are spread too thin trying to subdue all these riots, and it doesn't help that half of the force is off sick. Also, higher-ups aren't saying much either. The orders that are coming in are vague and inconsistent. Feels like they are clueless as we are." As he spoke, Mitchell's voice waved, and he coughed violently, doubling over. Mark and David moved in quickly to help him, easing him into a chair. "Are you alright, sir?" Mark asked, concern etched on his face. Mitchell waved him off, trying to catch his breath. Yeah, I'm fine. Just a bit under the weather is all, nothing to worry about." But it was clear that he wasn't fine at all. His skin was pale and clammy, and he looked like he was on the verge of collapsing. David exchanged a worried glance with Mark, but there was nothing they could do. Mitchell cleared his throat, regaining some composure. "Listen, lads, this is going to be a long night. Take a breather, get some rest. We are not done yet. We are going back out there," he said as he gestured towards the command building. The city was burning, and whatever was happening out there wasn't something that they could fix with batons and tear gas. But of course they had no clue about the horrors that were to come in the next few hours. David looked at Mark, who gave him a tired nod. "Come on, David," he said, patting our man on the shoulder. "Let's go get some water. It's going to be a long night." They walked away, leaving Mitchell still slumped in his chair, coughing. They entered the building and sat down in the break room, a thick, suffocating silence hanging in the air as the TV flickered with chaotic images. The news anchors were struggling to maintain any sense of professionalism as they gave their reports. Their voices were strained, and their eyes darted nervously between scenes and teleprompters. Scenes of riots, violence, and mayhem flashed across the screen. The officers couldn't believe what they were seeing. Some even fell to their knees in prayer. David sat with Mark, Carter, Lee, and the rest of his team, still wearing their gear, helmets resting on the tables and on the ground beside them. Mark leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, watching intently as the newsfeed switched to footage of London streets. Buildings were on fire, crowds were tearing each other apart, and the military and the police were struggling to maintain control. "What in the world is going on?" Lee muttered. "It's not just here," Mark said, shaking his head. "It's everywhere. Look," he said, as he passed around his phone. The TV screen cut to a scientist in a lab coat standing in front of a hastily assembled press conference. He looked utterly exhausted, his eyes red-rimmed, as if he hadn't slept in days. He gripped the edges of a podium, knuckles white, trying to steady himself. "The IV-277 virus, responsible for the recent pandemic," he began, his voice shaky, "has mutated in a way that we could not anticipate. It appears that those who are infected are experiencing severe neurological changes post-mortem. Now I want to reassure everyone that we have this..." The feed suddenly cut to static. The room went completely quiet, everyone staring at the screen, waiting for the feed to come back, but there was nothing. David looked at Mark, his expression mirroring his own. "This is well beyond our pay grade," Mason said from the back of the room. The radio on the wall cracked to life, and Sergeant Mitchell's voice came through, tense and urgent. "All officers licensed to carry firearms. We are issuing a right to shoot, effective immediately. All necessary measures to contain the situation are authorized. The army are being deployed across key areas of the city, but for now we are on our own here. Do not hesitate. Repeat, do not hesitate." As they all sat around contemplating the gravity of this situation, Jackson, another member of the team, burst into the room, out of breath and wide-eyed. "Lads, come quick, it's Carter, he's gone." Our man felt his stomach drop. "What? Carter was fine. He just got bitten by some nutter," David said aloud. Mark, David, Lee, and the others rushed down the hallway to the medical room, adrenaline surging through their systems as they pushed past other officers, crowding the door. Inside the room, the fluorescent lights flickered dimly, casting an eerie glow over the scene. Carter lay on the table, a white sheet pulled up over his face, his arm still loosely bandaged and bleeding from the bite. The room was silent. Everyone was stunned, struggling to process what just happened. 1 minute he was talking, joking, brushing off his injury like it was nothing, Jackson said. Then all of a sudden he just went silent and started to convulse. And just like that, he said, clicking his fingers, he was gone. "Poor kid," Mark whispered, running a hand through his hair. He was fine, he said a second time in frustration. They didn't even have long to grieve. Before any of them could really fully absorb what was happening, the radio blared again, Mitchell's voice cutting through the silence. "All units to the main entrance. We've got a large crowd amassing outside. Get your gear on, now, move." All units grabbed their helmets and weapons, rushing to the front of the building. As they stepped outside, the sight before them was like something out of a horror film. A crowd had gathered in the hundreds. Their eyes were wild and unfocused. The police formed a line, shields up and batons ready, but there was an unsettling mood in the air. There was no chanting, no shoutings for justice, just an eerie silence, punctuated by growls and low guttural noises that made the hair on everyone's neck stand up. The crowd surged forward, smashing against the shields. David swung his baton, striking a man in the chest, but he barely flinched, his eyes fixed on him with a vacant, animalistic stare. Another officer beside David hit a woman across the shoulder, but she kept coming. "Push them back," Mitchell ordered over the radios, but it was like trying to hold back a tidal wave with their bare hands. The line eventually broke. The crowd pulled at the officers, dragging them down to the floor. Our man watched in horror as one of his own was pulled down, disappearing beneath the frenzied mob. He could hear the sickening sounds of bones cracking, and the screams of the officers were overwhelming. Tear gas, Mark shouted, fumbling for the canister. He pulled the pin and tossed it into the crowd. The gas erupted, thick clouds billowing into the air. However, it didn't have the effect he hoped for. The crowd didn't cough. They didn't even flinch. They just kept pushing forward, their eyes glazed and lifeless. "This isn't working," David yelled, trying to hold his ground against the onslaught. It was then that the order came crackling through their headsets. "All units, you are authorized to open fire. I repeat, open fire on anyone displaying signs of aggression. All measures to reinstate order must be taken." David and the others somewhat hesitated for a moment, gripping their sidearms. However, as the mob surged again, shots rang out. They watched as the front line of the crowd staggered backwards, bullets tearing through flesh. But, impossibly, they started to get back up, shambling forward with renewed fury. "What the hell?" Mark shouted, firing off another round. But it was useless. They didn't stop. They didn't feel pain. All units were being overrun. One by one, officers fell, dragged into the seething mass of bodies. There was no more order, just pure, unrelenting chaos. David grabbed Mark's arm, pulling him back as they retreated towards the entrance. "We are going back inside now," he shouted, panic gripping his chest. The police line broke completely, officers abandoning their posts. Others were too stunned to move, and they were swept away by the unrelenting crowd. They all retreated inside the HQ, slamming the door shut behind them. Officers scrambled to barricade the doors with all sorts of furniture, anything to keep the horde out. The banging started almost instantly, fists and bodies crashing against the door with terrifying force. David and members of his squad went up to the briefing room. A few moments later, Mitchell staggered in, coughing violently, his skin pale and clammy. He was getting worse by the minute. It didn't take a medic to see this. He stumbled in the room, grabbing the edges of a table to steady himself. "All the doors, every last one of them, need to be reinforced," Mitchell rasped, struggling for breath. "Anyone not licensed to carry a firearm is now authorized. If they get through, we are done. You boys just hold the line," he said before turning and heading back up the stairs to his office. He shut the door behind him, locking himself inside. David watched him go, his heart sinking. We were trapped, surrounded on all sides, he thought. There was no real plan, there was no backup coming, just thin hope that these barricades would hold. The banging grew louder and more relentless, as if those outside would never tire. They could only pray that they didn't find a way in. David stood there, gun in hand, Mark beside him. Only 25 officers were left. 25 officers, still able to stand and fight, that is. The other officers were too injured to be of any use. They were also running low on ammo. How could they have known that they would have needed a supply to keep a small army shooting? David stood near the entrance, peering around the corner at the barricades. "That ain't going to hold," he said to himself. The courtyard outside was now swarming with the dead. They were piling up against the door, determined to find a way in. "They are not stopping, are they?" Mark said, standing beside him, his voice tight with exhaustion. "They are not stopping, are they?" Mark said, standing beside him, his voice tight with exhaustion. "They just keep coming, more and more by the minute. David, we don't have the manpower, nor do we have the ammunition to stop them from getting in here. Surely backup would come at some point, right? We just need to hold off until then," Lee added. Mitchell's voice cracked over the intercom, weaker than before, the commanding officer, and his orders had grown increasingly erratic. "I'm sorry, boys. I failed you, failed the mission. I never had any children of my own, so many of you became my children over the years. I watched you grow, from boys to men, and I can say, I am damn proud of each and every one of you. Especially after tonight. You are some of the finest I've had the pleasure of serving with. You've shown great bravery." All the officers looked at each other with confusion, and then, over the intercom, they heard the sound of a gun cocking, followed by a deafening bang. They all flinched, and a sense of dread settled over everyone. "Oh shit," Mark muttered, looking at David with wide eyes. "Do you think he's—" "We need to go check on him," David said, grabbing his sidearm. Lee was the first one up the stairs, leading the way. The air was heavy with tension. They moved slowly, every step deliberate. When they reached the door to Mitchell's office, it was locked from the inside. Bobby, another officer, kicked it in, and the door swung open with a sickening crack. The sight on the inside was brutal. Mitchell lay slumped over in his chair, the side of his head a mess of blood and shattered bone, his service gun still in his hand, fingers gripping tightly around the grip, the smell of blood and gunpowder thick in the air. David and Mark silently walked over and laid Mitchell on the ground, and covered him in a white sheet. Now there was no one really in charge. But they left the room and they went back to their positions. Sometime later, panicked shots rang throughout the hallways, coming from the medical area, and all this noise from inside the building just raged the ones outside even more. David, Mark, Lee and a few others went to secure the medbay, while the other officers kept to their positions. "We need to move," David barked, heading back up the stairs with Mark close behind. As they reached the medical area, they saw them. The officers, who had been bitten and died, were now back on their feet, staggering through the building with the same lifeless eyes as the mob outside. They moved with jerky, erratic movements. "There's Carter," Mark shouted, pointing down the hallway. Carter, the officer who had been bitten earlier on in the night, was standing there, swaying from side to side. His eyes were a milky white, devoid of any life. David hesitated for a moment, his heart sinking as he called out his name. "Carter, mate, it's me, it's David." For a moment it seemed like Carter had come back, that he had recognized David and his team, but then his expressions shifted. He snarled, and without warning, he charged. David reluctantly raised his gun, and as Carter got closer, a shot rang out, hitting Carter square in the head, putting him down for good. The sound of gunfire filled the building, echoing off the walls, and the few remaining officers tried to subdue the newly turned. From downstairs also shots rang out as the infected broke through the barricade and got inside. There was too many of them. David turned back to his men. "We can't hold this," Mark said, his voice tight with fear. "There's too many. Too bloody many. And the ammo is nearly gone. We get out of here. That's the only chance we have now." As the other officers began to open fire on their former comrades, David radioed to the others in the building, voice urgent. "All units abandon your positions. Fall back to the garage. Fall back to the garage. Get to your cars and get the hell out of here." The comms crackled with frantic responses, but there was no time to wait. David and his remaining team fought their way through the corridors, navigating the chaos as the infected swarmed. Gunshots were conservatively fired. The garage was positioned in the basement, and getting there meant fighting for a gauntlet of the dead. They moved as fast as they possibly could, but every turn brought another cluster of infected, and more of David's team fell, friends that he had known for years, until there was only 3 of them left. Mark swung his baton, knocking back one of the attackers, while David and Lee fired off what few rounds they had left. Only Mark, David and Lee reached the garage alive. They forced open the wooden door and slammed it behind them, barricading it with wooden boxes. They could hear the groans and shuffling of the dead echoing through the hallway as they were coming closer to the door. So they hurried over into one of the squad cars, climbing in and slamming the door shut behind them. Come on, Mark shouted as David fumbled with the keys. Finally, David turned the ignition and the engine roared to life. But there was another problem, one they didn't think about. Someone had to get back out and manually open the garage door. "I'll go," Lee said, and before the other 2 could object, he had already sprung from the car and was running forward towards the metal shutters. He hit the button, but as he was running back, the wooden door leading towards the garage burst open under the weight that was pressing against it. The dead flooded in, cutting Lee off, and they swarmed him, bringing him down to the ground. "Drive, David!" Mark yelled, his voice cracking. David slammed his foot on the gas, and the car launched forward, barreling through the garage and slamming past the infected. The vehicle skipped around the corner, tires screeching as they raced up the ramp and onto the street. London was burning, the sky tinged with an ominous red as fires raged in the distance. The city was a war zone with no clear path to safety. Mark glanced over at our man. "What do we do now, Davy?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Where the hell do we go from here?" David just stared ahead, gripping the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing with the images of everything that just happened. "We just try our best to survive,"